it's a very exciting time for all of us who work on Cuba policy. We are thrilled to be joined by two experts who can discuss in greater detail this growing entrepreneurial sector in Cuba. Before we get started, just a little bit of context on the work that we do in this space. It's an understatement, I think, to say that the members of our America Society and Council of the Americas Cuba Working Group were thrilled with the President's December 17th announcement and then the swift implementation of regulations that followed just a month later. We have, since our Cuba Working Group's inception over 7 years ago now, really advocated for the use of presidential authority to allow for greater space for the U.S. private sector and civil society to build direct relationships in Cuba to advance dialogue, advance market reforms, advance economic development, and specifically advance the development of these new private enterprises in Cuba. As many of us here know, I think this burgeoning non-state sector that we're seeing is really a result of reforms on both sides of the Florida Straits. We had, from the U.S. side, President Obama's previous loosening of restrictions in travel and remittances, and then subsequently, as you know, as we saw, a lot more policy opening on December 17th. And then from the Cuban side, which we're going to get into a lot more in this discussion, President Raul Castro in 2011 provided a lot more official space for the operation of private enterprises in Cuba. We've been to the island in the past couple years. Our group has been to the island 3 times. It's really hard whether you're in Havana or Santa Clara or Camagüey. You're tripping over construction sites for private restaurants. You see the myriad of storefronts offering manicures and cell phone repairs and haircuts and colorful artwork. And we've been really excited about and fascinated by this growing and innovative class of entrepreneurs in Cuba. Ted and Arch's book, Entrepreneurial Cuba, The Changing Policy Landscape, is a really, I think, great publication that is taking us into a deep dive into this sector. You know, we are seeing, the book is giving us a great overview of the reform since 1959. It takes us through the special period of the 1990s. It takes us through Raul's reforms that happened a decade later, and then gives us a real great understanding of the state of entrepreneurship in Cuba right now, as well as the growing and I think really important non-agricultural cooperative sector that Arch is going to talk to us about. You have their full bios in your program materials, so I won't read them, but Ted Henken is joining us from Baruch College, and he is an expert and commentator on Cuba and has been for many years. Archibald Ritter is joining us as a distinguished professor in the Department of Economics at Carleton University in Canada, and I think you are one of the leading experts right now on this the cooperative sector and then the non-agricultural cooperative sector in Cuba right now. So we're thrilled to have you both with us today to discuss your book. We were joking that it's just the timing of the publication of this book is great. The December 17th announcement is I think going to lend a lot more people to want to read this book and to understand the state of play in Cuba right now. So the idea for this afternoon is we're going to allow Ted and Archibald to present to us for about 15 or so minutes each, and then we're going to open it up for, hopefully a nice long question and answer session. I know some of us in the audience today joined us yesterday. We had a great conference, the Cuba Opportunity Summit, that was hosted at NASDAQ, and myself and Ted and John McIntyre actually talked about entrepreneurship yesterday, and it was a shorter panel, and hopefully today we can get into a little bit more depth into the specifics of the sector. So Arch is going to start by focusing on, talk about the first time you were in Cuba. I believe you said it was 1965, and talk to us about, as I said, the cooperative sector, the underground economy, current tax structure for these private businesses, and then Ted will focus his discussion a little bit more on Raul's policy changes, the lingering internal obstacles that still exist, as well as an analysis from the U.S. policy side outlining, I think, both opportunities and challenges in this space. I do want to give a shout out as well and thank all of our webcast viewers, and thank Telefonica for supporting our webcast. As you can see, this is a pretty exciting event. A lot of people tried to register, but we had to close registration. So I think there's a lot of people joining us via webcast, so we welcome you as well. So without further ado, I will turn it over to you, Arch, to start us off.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here from the snowy north. The snow has not left Ottawa yet, so I'm happy to be down here. I'd like to thank the Americas Society, and I wish we had such an organization in Ottawa. So maybe we'll find a donor somewhere. I got going on Cuba as a student, actually, a long time ago in the 60s. I was sort of enthusiastic, but sort of dubious. I went there in 1965, and I fell in with a bad crowd. Almost immediately, I learned about the underground economy, the black market, illegal activities. And the first little event was a funny one. My first contact with the illegal economy. I don't know if any of you know Cuba, but Fidel always wanted to do things bigger and better than anybody else. So there is a gigantic ice cream parlor in the center of the city of Havana. That was up and running by 1965. To get in there, there were unbelievable lines, colas, stretching around the block. And then the first lineup, you'd get a ticket. Then you'd go into an internal lineup to wait for the ice cream. Well, I went with two underground economy friends, and they immediately cut to the beginning of the first line. All they had to do was to offer 3 cigarettes for 3 chits, which let us get into the interior line. Well, that was the beginning of my knowledge of the illegal economy, the underground economy, and I've been fascinated by that ever since. So I'm also fascinated by officialdom and everything that is said in the official economy, but I've always been aware of what was going on in the underground economy. Well, Cuba in the 1960s was very interesting. It was crazy economic policy. They were proposing instant industrialization at first. That didn't work. 10 million tons of sugar. That didn't work. The new man, in which material incentives were to be abolished. And at one point, they abolished accounting. Enterprises were not supposed to keep accounts. They did not know what the revenues were. They didn't know what their costs were. But this was all supposed to be orchestrated from 2 office towers in Havana. That didn't work. It was a big disaster by 1970, so they adopted Soviet orthodoxy. That worked. Plus Soviet planning orthodoxy, plus Soviet subsidization, plus policy stability for 15 or 20 years worked well. And that was the golden age of Cuban socialism. However, that fell apart in 1989, 1980, when the subsidization stopped. And then the special period, the crisis occurred. People to survive had to find other sources of economic activity. So they set up little enterprises, little businesses. That's when doctors started driving taxis and so on and so forth. And that was so widespread that Fidel Castro figured he had to ratify this and permit small enterprise, micro enterprise to operate. So he did that in 1993. 1995, he decided that was capitalism. You had to contain that. You can't let that grow. So policies were applied to restrict the growth of the sector until Raul came on the scene and continuing problems. So in 2010, Raul changed the policies, liberalized the sector in a major way, and Ted's going to talk about those policy changes. The title of our book is Entrepreneurial Cuba. I mentioned that to some friends, and they said, that's an oxymoron. But in fact, it's not. And what has happened, in fact, is that the nature of Cuba's planned economy has generated a country full of entrepreneurs. Why did this happen? How did it happen? Well, first of all, 1961, they established a rationing system. Everybody got the same ration, same little book, but everybody didn't consume the same amount of stuff, so people started buying and selling. Everybody became a sort of a micro-capitalist, buying and selling stuff. This stuff entered the black market quite often, plus stuff that had been stolen. And you had a black market then emerging for almost everything. A second factor was in the state planning system itself. There was no way the planners in office towers in Havana could foresee all of the dislocations, all of the turbulence, all of the changes that were occurring. The managers of each enterprise, in fact, had to go beyond the plan. They couldn't accept the plan because situations would change so quickly. So they would enter into illegal exchanges, buying inputs, selling their outputs. This was tolerated, though it was illegal. Enterprise managers then were appraised on meeting the plan targets, but this meant that a good plan manager was a good improviser, and he could deal on the black market effectively to provide all of the inputs. So those were two initial impacts. Then the third factor causing the explosion of small enterprise, of course, was the special period and the economic collapse, 35% reduction in GDP in 1990, if you can imagine that. People were desperate. The incomes they earned on the job would not buy what they needed to survive for the month. So they had to do other things. And as I mentioned, that's when the doctors started driving taxis and so on. So most of us in this room, we go to work, we do a job, we get paid our monthly income. We don't have to look all the time, scan the horizon for other money-making opportunities. In Cuba, that has not been true, especially for the last 20 years. Everybody has had to have an eye on other income-earning activities. So Cubans have become entrepreneurs. In the early 1990s, there was a joke that circulated in Havana, and that said, how do you make a Cuban entrepreneur? Answer, una balsa, a raft to leave the country, and 1 month in Miami. So it should have been no surprise that when things got tough, entrepreneurship bubbled up from the underground economy. And then when policies were liberalized again in 2011, there was a further bubbling up of entrepreneurial effort throughout the country, which has really been quite surprising. And at that time, it was very interesting. Raul finally came to the conclusion that there were a lot of low productivity employees in the state sector, and that the state was trying to do things that it didn't need to do, like run barbershops, run shoe repair shops, and that sort of thing. And he said that the state could fire, he didn't use the word fire, but it could redeploy 1.8 million workers. Where would those workers go? In the new private sector, the new emerging small enterprise sector. Well, what had happened was that the small enterprises, having been vilified for almost 50 years, all of a sudden they were to be the saviors of the Cuban economy, to develop the new higher productivity economic activities. Well, that was a major change. That was a repudiation of Fidel Castro's policies for half a century. And every policy innovation that Raul comes up with, it's applauded by Fidel and everybody, but in fact, it's a repudiation of what Fidel had done before. Well, I will leave the rest on the small enterprise sector to Ted, but just a few words on the cooperative sector, the underground economy as well. A very interesting thing in Cuba is the legal permission that was granted about 3 years ago, and the legal framework that was set out for cooperative non-agricultural enterprises. This was done initially on an experimental basis for about a 2-year period. Some 290 cooperative enterprises were established, and right about now the legal framework is being reappraised, reconsidered, and presumably very soon a definitive framework will be presented, and there will be a more rapid move towards cooperatives. The government's idea there is to switch a lot of government small enterprises in the services, but also perhaps small manufacturing, tradesmen, transportation, and so on, to switch these from the state sector to the cooperative sector. That could be very interesting. If that worked, that would maintain Cuba as sort of a different ideal for a lot of people who wanted a different view of how an economy could operate. It's also of interest because the way those cooperatives have been defined is that they are very, very democratic. Well, can they in fact be democratic in a one-party state where you don't have genuine political democracy? Or will the cooperatives contaminate the one-party system? Well, I'm not sure how that might turn out, but I'm sure that the government will try and control the cooperatives. But they have substantial potential if they come into effect. There are some problems with them. One of them is that they've been created pretty much from the top down, whereas cooperatives generally are from the bottom up. People get together and decide they want to do something together. In Cuba's case, the government is saying, okay, that beauty salon is now a cooperative. Would you like to be a member? So we'll see if that works. It's not clear yet. I'm hopeful. The underground economy, that has been so massive. I have to tell you one story. Oh, by the way, I had a list of 34 little illegal activities in the book. We were under pressure to reduce the length of the book, so Ted cut half of them out. But Cuba is just so full of economic illegalities, or was. One of them I must mention. I was walking past a cigar factory one evening just at dusk, and the security guard was out in front. He saw I was not a Cuban. He said, "Would you like to buy a cigar?" Well, okay. So he took me into the building. He took me into the office of the security guards. He opened the desk drawers, and there he had a big supply of cigars. I bought some, but I had to smoke them all before I left Havana. Well,
I bet you hated that, right?
Raúl's reforms, I think, will have reduced the informal sector substantially. We don't know by how much, but the fact that the underground, the fact that the small enterprise sector went from 150,000 people employed in it to close to 500,000 now, 470, 480,000. That suggests that a lot of those underground activities became legalized. So hopefully the underground economy has shrunk. It will never disappear. You have an underground economy here. We have one in Canada. You know the roots of that. Those will continue in Cuba as well. Finally, a few words on the future of the small enterprise sector. There are a number of possibilities. Could the reforms be reversed? I would say no. I agree with Raúl Castro on this. He says they're irreversible. I think that's probably true. There's no going back now, and because Raúl has made the change, all of the Communist Party and all of the media and everybody is officially in support of that. Well, there are some bureaucrats who are dragging their feet, but they're doing that against the will of the party, surprisingly. So I don't think there'll be a reversal of the policy. Will the policy be stable for a period of time? And there I would say yes, it will be stable until Raúl leaves the scene. I don't think Raúl will make any major new liberalization measures, although there are lots that could and should be made. But I think he's finished with the basic reform thrust now, and he's just going to watch this unfold pretty much. When he leaves the scene, I think there will be major changes. I think there will be further liberalization in the area of taxation, with respect to all of the regulations, with respect to professional self-employment, which is by and large still illegal in Cuba. So I think that there will be major change, and Cuba will have a blossoming of small and medium-sized enterprise. Right now it's all very small, micro enterprise. But I think very soon after Raúl leaves the scene, it'll move to medium enterprise as well. After that, Cuba is going to have some major choices to make. What kind of private sector does it want? Does it, and here, just to simplify, it can either have sort of a Cuban type style enterprise sector, or it can have sort of an international type private sector. And by the international, I mean if they throw their doors open to all foreign enterprise, if the foreign investment policy is wide open, then you will have the Home Depots, the Walmarts, and so on moving into Cuba. And I think that would be very unfortunate, because I think that would replace a lot of Cuban-style small enterprise. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention. The fact that all these controls have been placed on small enterprise so they can't get larger means that there are a whole lot of them. There is just a huge amount of entrepreneurship that's operating pretty effectively now. Well, I personally would not like to see all of that replaced by the big international organizations such as Walmart or McDonald's. There's a danger of that. The danger of that stems from the fact that the state enterprise already operates in some big enterprises, such as Gaviota Panamericana, which are oligopolistic, monopolistic, with perhaps thousands of little stores in the part of the Panamericana. It would be very easy if privatization were to occur for the government to say, okay, Walmart, give us $10 billion for, or whatever, for Panamericana and all its chain, and do what you want with it. That could be a real danger, I think. And personally, I would like to see Cuba remain culturally Cuba. I would like to see the myriad of entrepreneurs who've done tremendously creative things continue to exist and not be swallowed up by sort of large-scale multinationals. So that's my hope. Thank you very much.
Well, I was fighting to go first because, as you can see, it's going to be very hard to follow Arch Ritter. And you can also see why I was very lucky to, 15 years ago, have a conversation with him at a conference. And we hit upon the idea of writing this book together 15 years ago. So we have very good timing. We waited just for the right moment. We're going to write a joint letter to Presidents Castro and Obama, thanking them for making their change at the right moment. But one of the things that I appreciated when I first met Arch, when I heard him speak, but also you can appreciate today, is that either because of his personality or because he's Canadian, when he looks at Cuba, you get a fresh, straightforward, and thankfully non-ideological approach to the problem. He can criticize and praise different sides with equal vigor and equal expertise. And I was really attracted to that because I think that kind of analysis is lacking. Even though there's some great scholarship on Cuba, coming from the United States, I think that attitude and that approach is something that I admire and I wanted to be a part of. So that's why, in part, I was attracted to working with Arch. The other reason was, and here's my story, and it doesn't take place in Havana, it takes place in, of all places, Mobile, Alabama. So before I went to grad school at Tulane University, I had a job in Mobile, Alabama. My parents are both from Mobile, Alabama. And I had a job there working for Catholic Social Services. I was hired by Catholic Social Services Refugee Resettlement Program to resettle Cuban balseros coming in from Guantanamo Bay Naval Base. This is just after the balsero crisis in 1995. And on Saturdays, I would go down Government Street, which is the main drag in Mobile, Alabama, covered by old oak trees, and I would go to this beautiful library they have there. And I would, read and study and go on the internet in the library, but what I would also do is they always had a cart of books that were for sale. There were old library books that they were trying to get rid of. And there was actually a lot of times very well priced and very interesting stuff. And among the books there, for 50 cents, I bought Arch's first book. Now, I don't know if this is a black market story or a discount aisle story, but I got his book for 50 cents. And the next year, I went to Tulane University, and I started to focus increasingly on Cuba because I had worked with the Cuban refugees, rafters, and I was very curious after meeting them about the island that they came from. And one of the things that helped me as I tried to understand the island that they came from was Arch's book. I think it was published in 1973, and it was the fruit of those cigarettes that he paid the guy off with at Coppelia Ice Cream Parlor, of his investigations. And so I'm very happy to be working with Arch. I also wanted to recognize a couple other people before I get into the meat of what I wanted to say to you. First of all, I'm very happy, thanks to Meg Crahan, that Diana Echevarria is here. She is a Cuban economist, sociologist. She works at the Centro de Estudios de la Economía Cubana, and she has actually studied this in Cuba. She's at Columbia University this semester, and Meg has done great work to bring Cuban scholars here to New York to share their research with us. Another thing that she's done that is very impressive is that before meeting her today, actually, I met two of her graduate students, both Italian women who were getting their PhDs and had gone to Cuba and hooked up with her, and she advised them. And both of them have done really great research on the Cuban economy and on kind of the anthropological world of the Cuban economy, the changes in kind of business mentality, and the role of women in the sector. So I'm sure that she will be doing some public presentations during the semester if she hasn't already. So make sure that you get signed up for that.
Stand up so we can
see. John McIntyre is here, and I shared a panel with him yesterday. He is doing great work with the Cuba Emprende Foundation. He's been trying to keep a low profile, but his work has been very good, and it's going to be hard for him to do that. But they're doing great work training through the Catholic Church, partnering with the Catholic Church, training thousands of entrepreneurs in Cuba, really taking advantage of the opportunity, both before the announcement and hopefully now more after the announcement that this opportunity presents. So John, maybe you can wave your hand or something. In the very, very back, there is a recently minted PhD from the New School, Gabriel Vignoli, who is Cuban-Italian. And he just did his dissertation on a topic very similar to this. Schizonomics is the name of his dissertation. And he and I just wrote an article together that will be published online today or tomorrow or yesterday by the Social Science Research Council called Enterprising Cuba. Actually, thank to Arch because he got the email. He says, "I'm busy with my grandkids. Ted, why don't you do it?" So I recruited Gabrielle, and we just wrote this. So now a word from our sponsor. I wanted to let you guys know that Arch and I published something called Cuba's Internal Embargo, which is a kind of summary of some of the arguments in our book, and copies of this 4-page, very brief kind of reflection are outside, and we probably ran out of the book because we only had a few copies because they're very heavy, right? But there should be circulating around an order form, and you can get this $79 book for just $35 plus shipping. So the order form will allow you to get the book. It's the publishing industry is in crisis, in the academic industry. Normally sell books to libraries that have budgets that can pay $79. So I wouldn't buy my book for $79, but I would buy it for $35. So I encourage you to do that.
Can you photocopy and put it in one?
Ah, okay, that's good. We're going to put it in el paquete, right? He says there's good advice from an entrepreneur here. So in the article and in the book, there's this kind of two little sayings that capture the viewpoint of Cuban entrepreneurs. And I think that word entrepreneur is very nice. But remember, in Cuba, they're not officially called entrepreneurs. They're called self-employed or trabajadores por cuenta propia, which could be translated as on your own ism, right? So one way of understanding what's happening is the government is leaving people to their own devices. That means more economic freedom, but that could also mean in many cases the state is abandoning you to your own devices. So it's good for people who have ideas, who are well-placed, who are entrepreneurial, but it's maybe not good for other people who just get laid off and don't have anything to do, right? Last summer, every summer, I go to the Association for the Study of the Cuban Economies conference in Miami. And this summer, we had the great privilege through the Cuba Study Group and Phil Peters to have 5 female Cuban entrepreneurs who are real entrepreneurs, not abandoned, but people who really have ideas and innovation. And they came and they shared their stories of starting up their businesses and running them with us. And one thing that they told us about terminology was really important. I was emailing Tomas Bilbao from the Cuba Study Group beforehand, and I said, okay, what are their names? What are the businesses that they run? And how should we introduce them? And he said, well, first of all, I think I maybe wrote him in Spanish, so I said, las cuenta propistas. And he says, first of all, they've told me very explicitly, no somos cuenta propistas. And I was like, well, what are they? I mean, this is what it's called. He's like, no, somos emprendedoras. And they insisted on being introduced as entrepreneurs, not as on-your-owners. Because for them, this was something that was born out of a passion and of a talent that they have, not out of a government imposition. But the truth is that people like this are mixed together. There are people like these women who have employees who aren't really entrepreneurs. They work for an entrepreneur. So there's a big mixture of different types of people with different motivations who are differently placed doing different products in this sector. The anecdote that we heard in the interviews over many years was this. And I'll keep telling this joke until people stop laughing, but I think it's very, very helpful. And I've said it before, but it's very helpful, and we use it at the beginning of this article that we wrote in Current History. We would hear from Cuban entrepreneurs who ran businesses the following 2 sayings that kind of captured their frustration and their philosophy. The first was, and those of you who speak Spanish will probably be able to help me, so I'll say the first half, and we'll do a Cuban call and response, and you guys see if you can fill this in. So this first half of this is, el ojo del amo. Okay, well, I'll translate it in a second. So, el ojo del amo engorda el caballo. Okay, that's the first one. Can I get a volunteer to translate that into English for us? Just shout it out, yeah.
The owner's eyes make, the horse get fat.
Okay, the owner's eyes fatten the horse, or the eye of the owner fattens the horse. Okay, think about that for a second, coming from someone who runs a business in Cuba. What are they trying to say? The other saying is, el que tenga tienda, y si no, okay, good. So, this works, right? You guys are good. Put on the music, right? Let's start dancing, okay? So, whoever has a store, what should they do with the store? They should take damn good care of their store, right? Run it well. Discipline, focus. Right? Productivity, efficiency. If they can't do that, what should they do with the store?
Sell it.
Okay, sell it. Okay, Fidel was deaf to these 2 sayings. Raul has started to listen to these 2 sayings. Okay, and that is essentially that captures what we try to do in the book. We want to compare Fidel's policies toward the private sector, even though Raul can't even say those words, the private sector, right? The non-state sector. We want to compare those to Raul's much more attuned, but still policies that balance economic logic with ideological and political logic, right? Carmelo Mesalago and Jorge Perez Lopez have a great book that came out a couple years ago. And the book, like much of what Carmelo writes, always goes back to the battle in Cuba making economic policy making between guiding economic policy on political and ideological grounds or guiding it on economic grounds, right? Ideology versus pragmatism. And you have this pendulum that swings back and forth, and Arch gave a really good brief history of that pendulum. I call it Raul Castro's, and before it was Fidel Castro's, economic mambo. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Sometimes it's 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, right? So in 1995, you had 1996. After a few steps forward, there were more steps back, okay? And so Arch used the word, quoting Raul, irreversible. And I agree with him, but don't mention the word irreversible to a Cuban who lives in Cuba. Why? Because they have been hoodwinked too many times in the past. They're so used to the pendulum is coming back the other way. Don't stick your head up, because it may get cut off. If you start a business, then it will be confiscated. In China, there's this saying regarding the economy that's often associated with Deng Xiaoping, but I did a little research, and it's actually originated with Mao, right? The saying is, let 100 flowers bloom, let hundreds of different schools of thought contend. And I always thought that that saying was a hopeful one, related to Deng Xiaoping's changes starting in 1978 with the economy. But I discovered, reading a little bit of Chinese history the last couple months, is that actually that was a sinister plot by Mao. It was Mao's idea to have that 100-flower campaign. He let everybody expose themselves as a reformer, and then he got rid of all those people, right? Let's hope. I don't think that's happening in Cuba by any means, but Cubans can be forgiven for being skeptical, even cynical about the changes, because they've seen this movie before. I think this is a different movie, and I think this apple has fallen far enough from the tree of Fidel to be significantly different. But the question that we try to address in the book, is it sufficiently different economically? So let me speak now some specifics, and this will get to what she actually said I was going to tell you, right? Which is the things in the economy that Raul has done that we applaud, we analyze and we applaud in the book, and then the things that we urge more movement on and we identify as still blockades, obstacles. I call it sometimes, more for the newspapers than as a scientific term, the internal embargo, because there's an external embargo that we criticize a bit in the book, but we focus mostly on the internal steps forward and the lacking steps forward. And so what are those? To look at Raul's reforms starting in 2010, we can identify a number of really positive things. And when I started to read through the law in September, October of 2010, I was like, he read my dissertation. God bless this man, right? It's my doing, right? Not, right? There's a lot of great Cuban economists that have been whispering in his brothers in his ear and saying very, very similar things, the findings that we have. So Cubans, for the first time since 1968, can employ other Cubans. That's a huge change, right? It's especially in a place that used to call that exploitation of man by man, right? That is something they've realized was already happening. Let's legalize it. There's some controls on it that we can criticize, but this is the ability to hire other people. Also, in the 1990s and the early 2000s, many people would complain to me about the bureaucratic nightmare of trying to open a business. And even worse than that, the fact that many licenses just wouldn't ever be issued. They said, oh, we've stopped issuing paladar licenses, no more. If you didn't get it last week, too bad, right? Also, once you were in business, often they would say the inspectors exist to either solicit bribes or close us down. Those two things, those two phenomena, not being able to get a license or having your license taken away, are very rare, if non-existent now. The government gives licenses virtually at will. It's government bureaucracy like you have everywhere else in the world, but people get them, and that's why we've seen this growth. That's also very positive. There's been some progress in terms of the tax code. We criticize the tax code is not going far enough. Arch, as the economist in this duo, did the crunching of the tax code and the numbers to look at it, and it's improved, but there's still a penalty for any business that uses lots of inputs. They can't deduct the full value of their inputs from their taxes, so that then they end up paying taxes on stuff that they've bought, not on money that they've made, right? So this is a problem, but there's been one of the things that Raul does also that's more a kind of a style that's much more pragmatic than his brother and very positive, is that he listens. He listens to both positive and negative feedback, and then he changes course when he realizes that that feedback is saying, hey, this is not working, right? The tax code is too much. Or before, people would get taxed on hiring just a few employees. Now, they've allowed you to hire employees up to 5 without any tax liability. So they've listened and they've changed course, right? That's also positive. What are the things that are still lacking? Oh yeah, one more thing that will lead me into the things that are still lacking. In 1993, they legalized 117 private occupations. That grew up to about 157 by 1996. Then in the early 2000s, they eliminated 40 of those, meaning that in 40 categories you could no longer get a license. If you had one, you could keep it. So it kind of went back down again. When Raul reintroduced this legislation, they made it 178, and that has grown to 201. So if you just compare the numbers, that's good. There's progress. But we shouldn't even be talking about a list of occupations that are legal. There should be a list of things that the government says you can't do, and then everything else should be left up to the inventiveness and the innovation of the private sector, or of the non-state sector, however they want to call it. But the fact that there's a list is still an indication that there is a mentality of control, that we want to keep this under control, and there is a fear that economic freedom and power may lead to political freedom and power, and the government is very nervous about that and wants to manage it, and the idea of managing it makes it very slow and bureaucratic and makes them fearful of this. One other example of that, or two other things that are related to that. One is that most of the occupations currently on that list of 201, and in our appendix, we have a translated list of those 201 occupations and kind of a little brief history of where they came from and when they were added, the taxes that they have to pay monthly. So in the appendix, we have that list. Richard Feinberg also has a list in a paper he wrote for the Brookings Institution. So most of these occupations are not just unproductive, but they are medieval in their orientation and in what they could actually contribute to the economy. I wrote down a couple of them because I wanted to get them right, because they are kind of bizarre in their orientation. Let me see if I can find them. Okay, party clown, mule driver, button upholsterer, okay, spark plug tester and cleaner. Okay, and that's not just, I didn't just cherry pick the most ridiculous ones. There's probably about half of them are like that, maybe even more. There are some that are not like that. And so the criticism and the recommendation. The criticism is that many of these things are survival-oriented things that are not productive, that are not efficient, and that won't really contribute anything to the economy. They will allow people to survive, and that was part of the thing. Legalize this and you can take care of yourself. But they aren't really around creating jobs or producing employment or goods and services. So our recommendation then is to allow some or all professions to be part of this list, right? You can be a bartender, but you can't open up a private clinic or a law practice or an architecture firm. Now, some people have managed to do this in inventive ways, and Cubans are very inventive, as we've learned, and they've managed to have these kind of professions either through the cooperative sector, and that might be the state's preference, because that's been pushed forward, and I had a good conversation with a Baruch graduate who kind of gave me his take on that. And maybe he'll ask and share that information when we have the Q&A. So there's that, okay? So there's the good things, steps forward, but then there's the restrictions that are still there. Another big issue is Cubans complain, who run these businesses, that there's no reliable source of wholesale goods available. And that's based on the fact that import-export is a state monopoly. And anytime the Cuban people, through their businesses and through the mule network that bring stuff in, have tried to do that, and they continue to do it, those mule networks have been shut down, or they were trying to shut them down. And many of the businesses that they feed, like the retail clothing business that had popped up all across the island, was closed down because they were competing very well in terms of price, quality, and diversity in terms of the clothes that they were selling from Miami, from Ecuador, from wherever, in their shops versus the state monopoly shops, right? And the state didn't like that. At the same time, the Cuban government targeted and got rid of the scourge that was infecting all across Cuba of the 3D, private 3D cinema, okay? Cubans had, there's a license in the list for entertainment, equipment operator for children's entertainment. And they were thinking of like little ponies at the fair that take kids around, but this Cuban's like, I'm going to Miami, I'm going to buy an entertainment system that has 3D movies, and I'm going to set it up at my house, and then I'm going to charge everybody a peso or $1 or whatever. They can come in and watch avatar. Okay? The government shut that down. So let me now conclude by talking about U.S. policy, right? We say almost nothing about U.S. policy in the book. There are lots of people who speak very eloquently and powerfully and obviously effectively against the U.S. embargo, and more power to them. But we really try to focus on Cuban policy. But at the end of the book, we do recognize the work of some organizations, and one organization especially, Cuba Now, that has advocated for an engagement approach that will be much better at reaching U.S. goals and serving U.S. interests at the same time as helping engage and empower the Cuban people. And that is largely the new policy, and we applaud it. So we like that. But because Cuba continues to be listed as a state sponsor of terror, and because there's still layers and layers of pieces of the embargo in place, even though Obama is trying to carve it out, he has limited power. He's trying to make economic policy and foreign policy with one hand tied behind his back. And so we applaud the changes, but we call on Congress, right, to go further, to be more bold, to read our book, right? So, Marco, if you're watching, compra mi libro y léatelo, all right? I actually bought his autobiography and read it, so he should buy my book, our book, and read it, right? I'm not going to mention Robert Menendez because he got other things to worry about right now, right? So the silver lining in these changes are what, right? The silver lining is that now Cubans who are in the private sector can sell goods and services to the United States. But the devil's in the details. When this came out, the list of exceptions to that was very long, of the products that can't be imported. Mimi Whitefield at the Miami Herald has a really good pair of articles in March that kind of go over this. One was kind of, oh man, this is a horrible list. But then there's another article a week later that's like, well, we've looked at the list again, we've talked to some people, and actually there's more there than meets the eye if you go into the weeds. The other thing that's really good and positive are services. And we saw this morning, those of you who got your news this morning probably read about Airbnb, right? I'm actually leaving for Miami on Saturday. Don't tell anybody, especially my co-op board, but there's somebody staying in my apartment while I'm gone through Airbnb, right? Airbnb is a fabulous thing, at least for now, we'll see, and for me. But Cubans have already lined up. There's 1,000 Cubans who are listed on Airbnb, and as of today, they can now go live. They've probably already been doing this. How can they do this legally? Well, this is a service. And it's a service they are exporting to the United States. Now, the people who stay in their homes, I'm not sure how they're going to verify this, have to be on one of those 12 categories. But this is like a new version of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, I think, right? If they're going to actually go after this. So I'll leave it with Airbnb, and you guys can ask us questions about other things, all right?
Great, thanks so much. I think that's a really great, yeah. I think that's a great overview from both of you guys, a good historical perspective, a policy perspective, and kind of what we're seeing on the ground today. We have about just about 30 minutes for a question and answer session. I'm going to abuse my role as moderator and ask the first question, and then we're going to open it up to all of you guys. Something that we had talked about yesterday on the entrepreneurship panel at the Cuba Summit, which I think might be interesting for this crowd as well, is to maybe get a little bit more specific about some of the success stories from the ground that we're seeing. So what areas of business are doing really well? Maybe give us some examples of these non-agricultural cooperatives and what those are and what we're seeing, just to give us maybe a more particular sense of some of the workings on the ground. Maybe Arch, if you want to start, and then.
Okay. With such an explosion of non-agricultural micro-enterprise, there are a variety of areas that are doing very well. The most obvious one is the paladares, the restaurants. And Ted has studied those in detail. I've visited lots of them.
The whole chapter 8 is a chapter that is dedicated to the harrowing and the seems triumphant history of the Cuban paladar. So buy the book and read chapter 8, right?
Okay, there's the answer. No, but there's just a huge array of different types of paladares that are high quality, great decor, great food. The most surprising one, actually set up by a Ukrainian-Canadian friend of mine, is a Russian paladar. And apparently his view, I'm not sure how well this is working out, but his view and his wife's view is that there is such nostalgia for the links with the Soviet Union. 2 million Cubans learned Russian, for example, that he thinks there's going to be a market for Russian cuisine. I have my doubts about that. But it's really amazing when you travel around and see the varieties of paladares. But this is the case with many small enterprises. The ones that earn the big incomes, of course, are the ones that cater to tourists. And the main ones there are the restaurants and the bed and breakfasts. But I would say the vast majority of paladares are modest things. They're low-income people providing basic goods and services for other low-income people. And the incomes are not bloated. You know, the self-employment sector has been criticized heavily in the past for widening income distribution. That's true, but only to some degree. And it's only in these tourist-oriented areas where incomes have shot up. In the vast majority, where they're servicing a Cuban clientele, incomes are better, but they aren't out of line. In terms of agricultural cooperatives have existed for a long time in name. They were called cooperatives, but they did not function like true cooperatives. They were subject to a high degree of control from the planning authorities. For the new non-agricultural cooperatives, there's questioning as to how independent they're going to be. Some people say that some of the basic cooperatives, there's a bus line in Havana that is called Cooperativa, and the buses run around. It looks like a real cooperative. I'm not sure myself how, to what extent that is a genuine cooperative, and there's a taxi system that's a cooperative as well. Otherwise, I see tremendous potential in future for service workers of all tradesmen, establishing cooperatives of plumbers, electricians, construction, concrete work, and so on and so forth. So it's happening. But with the cooperatives, the verdict is still out. We haven't seen how well that's going to operate.
I would agree with the last part, especially given that large parts of Cuba need to be rebuilt, refurbished, and Cubans have the skill. They need the material and the legal mechanism to do that. I would add very briefly to that list some of the more technological things that have been legalized. So in the list, there is this bright light called a telecom agent. There's also a computer programmer. There's also a translator. And there's also some people who are already working as middlemen, and they were like people who stand at the airport and say, do you want to stay in this private home? That's now, you can get a license to do that legally. So people who kind of are these entrepreneurs, connective tissue between customers and clients. The internet is also booming with all kinds of stuff on what's happening in Cuba and people selling through the internet. Even though Cubans have very little access to internet and the speed is slow and the price is high, they are taking advantage of the internet. If you want to find out about paladares, for example, in Cuba, the best thing to do, except for going to Cuba, is to go to TripAdvisor. And you go to TripAdvisor and there's detailed comments, there's photos, there's information, there's reviews, and it's crowdsourced information, which is great, and you also got to take it with a grain of salt, but it gives a lot of rich detail. And other areas like Airbnb and other internet kind of connective tissue to advertise various services.
Great, and I will just add, I think the point of the non-agricultural cooperatives is an interesting one. In our trips to Cuba, meeting with Cuban economists and Cuban government officials too, in separate conversations, I think cooperatives are something that's an easier conversation to have with these actors on the ground. I think this kind of quasi private sector model is something that I think has tremendous potential for growth in Cuba right now, and I think is something that you get a little bit of pushback. I think when you talk about this total private enterprise concept, but I think the cooperative is this really interesting medium between the two that I think we're going to see an explosion of growth in the sector moving forward. Great, so with that, I'm going to open it up to you guys, and I know there's a number of questions, so I'll start here in the front. And we have microphones going around, so if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and then asking your question. Thanks.
My name is Maximo Friedman. I run a international corporate finance advisory group.
No, sorry, I think they're saying it's not. Is that on? Sarah, can you just make sure, just push the button up and, okay.
Hello?
Perfect, I think it's working now.
Maximo Friedman. I run a, I'm a principal at an international corporate finance advisory group, Washington, D.C. based. My question is this: small entrepreneurs in Cuba have to rely on the state banking system for finance, and I go back to Professor Ritter's comment about the ice cream parlor, state-owned, assuming, for example's sake, that the production of ice cream in a small corner shop is allowed under the 200-some list. Can the cuenta propista or emprendedor open several branches of little ice cream shops and get finance from some entity to, for working capital purposes and the like?
I would say yes. I would say yes and no. On the yes side, finance has been theoretically made possible, but most of it's not going to the private enterprise sector, and very little is available. Most people get financing get it through remittances. So it's the backdoor financing. It's not officially financing a business, even though that's often what the remittances are doing. People can now, there used to be only one private business allowed per household, and that has changed, and people can hold multiple licenses, and so you can have that potential for expansion and kind of chain. I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
No, that's good.
Yeah. So I would say that on the list of complaints and the list of problems, I said wholesale, but also credit is a huge issue. And it's happening mostly through remittances, not through the banking system, because the banking system isn't willing or isn't able yet to deliver significant amounts of access to that kind of capital. It might have to do with collateral issues. It might have to do with just lack of experience in that area. But in my experience, that is done through the back door.
And I will just add...
Follow-on question,
sure.
Very briefly. Is there any leeway, or would you see that the authorities in Cuba would be sympathetic to the establishment of some kind of a microfinance entity?
Yes, indeed. Such a microfinance organization has in theory been established. Its loans, I think, the last information I saw, the loans went mainly for house maintenance and refurbishment, more so than to small enterprises. But such a mechanism exists. The Cubans have talked about it for some time, and my guess is that it will expand. But remittances from abroad are the chief source, and self-financing is all important.
Yeah, and I was just going to add too, actually, specifically on microfinance. I think that there is clearly a huge market for microfinance right now, and that access to capital is a huge issue. And so this is something that we've also been talking to, both from a U.S. policy perspective, but also, as you said, with the Cuban side, welcome that. And I think this is something that we're going to see this type of area really grow in, if not the very immediate future, I think in the near future. I think there's extreme potential for that, and you have a population that is well educated, who, these are strong businessmen and women who I think would be great clients of microfinance services. So I think really, in the work that we've done in this sector, I think that that's a huge area for growth right now. Thanks. So I'm going to take right here, and then I'm going to go to the back, after. So we'll start here, and then to you in the back,
Yoram Kinberg, ex-JP Morgan Chase banker, and currently own a boutique investment bank. We work with private equity groups that are looking for investment in emerging markets, and Cuba is viewed as a potentially emerging market. The question is, to you and maybe to the professor as well. If you were to advise the government 10 to 20 years from now, where would Cuba's competitive advantage be in the global scale? Not just to have a little restaurant, in addition to tourism and cigars.
Yeah.
Take two models, Israel as a startup nation and Singapore. They're about the size of Cuba, and Cuba could be hopefully as big as GDP per capita, but they have to make some choices.
I would say two things off the top of my head that either have already been established or are being established. The first is the biotechnology the pharmaceutical industry. Cuba has a really developed, and they put a lot of resources in that, and they can compete because they've even produced drugs that many people are lobbying to get access to in the United States. So that's one area. Another area is tech, computer programming, and other things. I mean, it's kind of ironic, though, because Cuba is one of the least connected places on the earth, or at least in the Western Hemisphere, in terms of public access to the internet. But there's a school for technology and people who are really advanced in coding and writing computer programs. And I think that that could definitely be an area. Both of those areas are largely under the government, but as the government becomes more, let's say, creative, innovative, and open, then those things could be, I think the government wants to control the profits and keep the people, but they also know that they can lose people. Immigration is a huge issue of losing talented young people, and if they don't reward those people, then those people often will leave. And so that's, I would say, the two things that I think of that aren't, cigar and rum, et cetera.
Okay.
Please.
I think the biotechnological, pharmaceutical possibility is there. Cuba faces great risks because they have, I think some of the deals they have now that earn a lot of foreign exchange are sweetheart deals with countries like Venezuela, which is having its difficulties. It has to continuously come up with new drugs, as any pharmaceutical enterprise does, if it's going to survive, because anything it produces 20 years later can be produced as a generic product by anybody else. So it's a race against time for Cuba in that sense. I'm not sure if it'll win. I would say that two of the big sectors for Cuba in terms of comparative advantage are agriculture and everything around that, agricultural processing. That was a big one before. But Cuba is one big garden. They could be producing a wide variety of fruits and vegetables for Canada. We import things from South Africa, mangoes, mango juice. We import things from Spain. All those things could be provided to Canada and the eastern United States by Cuba. So that will need major changes in the agricultural sector, agricultural policy, food processing. But that's a big potential. And the second thing is tourism. And that's already been proven. But when relations with the United States normalize, when Cuban Americans from New Jersey can buy a timeshare condominium or can spend their winter months in Havana, that's going to be a huge thing for Cuba. So right now the tourism has gone from 2 million to about 3 million. But after full normalization with the United States, there's going to be a tsunami of tourism, as you know. Curiosity tourism, 50-year pent-up demand, snowbird tourism, March break tourism, you name it. So that's going to be a big thing. That's going to lead to a big construction boom. And tourism is, I would say, it can be a sector with very widespread and positive linkages to the rest of the economy. I know lots of people criticize tourism, and that's possible, but there are some good benefits in terms of broad distribution of income. An important factor is to maintain Cuban ownership and control, I would say.
Medical tourism is one of them.
Right.
Medical tourism, it is, actually. Yeah, I actually was on a plane one time flying in from, I think I was from the Bahamas, and there was a lot of people who were going to get dental care in Cuba. Because it was better and it was cheaper than in the Bahamas or wherever else, which is fascinating since they poured so much money into the medical field. Daima, did you want to add?
I'm going to move. Sorry. Oh, you want to add that? I'm sorry, I'm going to go to the woman in the back here. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This is an excellent session, by the way. Thank you so much for putting together. I looked at Cuba through the lens of technology as well. I'm Teresita Kruger. I'm a senior fellow at Fordham University.
Can you put the microphone a little closer? Thanks.
Sure. I'm a senior fellow at Fordham University, and I'm also a co-founder of a technology advocacy organization in the Bronx. So as I said earlier, I looked at Cuba through the lens of technology. So to that end, I mean, Cuba is still woefully behind with regard to technology and connectivity capabilities. So to that end, would either of you be able to comment as to whether or not you see or know or are thinking in terms of adopting a model where venture capital type opportunities could penetrate Cuba and provide from the ground floor some of those capabilities, not unlike what we've seen in other economies that have been behind the eight ball somewhat to a great extent, but in addition have had cultures and ideologies that have been somewhat prohibitive, such as, and I'll just mention, you know, Jordan, parts of Africa as well. So again, could you comment with regard to any models that you see out there that might be conducive and helpful in Cuba? Thank you.
Thanks.
I would say that when talking about Cuba, never use the word penetrate. Okay? Besides its obvious sexual connotations, it also has a very imperialist connotation, and even though that's not what you meant, they're very sensitive to those kind of things, and they see them as threats often versus as opportunities. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is that I would go to a blog called The Internet in Cuba. That's actually the name of the blog. It's written by Larry Press, and he's a professor of computer science at Dominguez Hills in California. And he has written a lot about various models to get Cuba up to speed in terms of its connectivity. And he talks about the Cuban model that's not working, right? Heavy government control and censorship, and the slow steps they've taken recently. Then he said that there's the U.S. model, which he actually doesn't recommend because we actually in the United States, relative to some European and Asian countries, have a very problematic internet sector in terms of how the pricing, in terms of the speed, in terms of the monopoly control in certain areas. So he talks about some different kinds of models. I won't expand on it. I'll let you guys go and read his stuff. But he says that if Cuba is creative, it can certainly come up with other kinds of models that try to balance broad access with what they always talk about as social access. And that, in that case, social access won't be a euphemism for government control. It will actually be prioritizing, broad access for everybody and not making it only based on the market, right, to connectivity. So I would just say that.
That's good.
Okay. Yep, go ahead. Yep.
Just the Internet in Cuba. That's the name of it. But he kind of trickily, he makes the URL La Red en Cuba or La Red Cubana, something like that. So he has them both.
Yeah, the gentleman here, yep. I'm going to go here, take one up here, and then back there. I see you there. And then here, yep.
Yeah, hi, I'm a cinematographer, and I shot a lot of stuff in Cuba 16 years ago, the last year of the Clinton administration. I've been down there quite a bit informally for the last year shooting, and there's some huge changes. You were talking about the restaurants and things like that, and I just want to add something to what you were saying, because 16 years ago we loved to go to Cuba and shoot for a month because we got our 2,300 calories a day and we came back nice and slender. Now they have world-class restaurants all over Havana. If you want to
fatten up,
you want to eat well, you want to fatten up, you can. But what I find very interesting down there, it's just not tourism. What you see is there's all over Havana. There's a lot of restaurants opening in houses, these beautiful old houses with nice tables, with very elegant service, and very high prices. And it's Cubans who are going to these restaurants. I was just shocked. I think there's a lot of money floating around Cuba that's never shown itself. Or maybe it just showed itself out in Myanmar. But now, you're seeing a much more accepting attitude towards spending.
La farándula cubana.
I don't know if you feel that same way, but
Well, I would recommend people read the Newsweek cover story a couple of weeks ago. It talked about the Bay of Fat Cats, and it talked about the difference between the fat cats, who you can see in these places, and then the generalized penury that you find in public, right? And so some of this is hidden, but yeah, you go to places and Cubans are the customers, whereas before my experience was it was almost always foreigners or tourists.
Yeah,
Interesting.
But
Sorry, I need to move the question on to the next participant.
Okay, I just have one question about show business, so if I could just, because I just wanted to make a comment. What I see is there's a lot of movie companies and stuff gearing up to
Can you
shoot.
hold the mic closer to your mouth,
Yeah,
please?
there's
Thanks.
a lot of movie companies I know of, Netflix and everybody else, who are gearing up to do a lot of shooting in Cuba over the next year. So I'm sure on that level there's been a lot of fluidity between the government and these companies to allow us to be shooting there. So that's a good thing.
Thanks. And here in the front, and then I will go and to you in the back. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Jim Friedlander. I'm the president of Academic Arrangements Abroad, and we've done, we're a tour operator based in New York. We do perhaps, 100 groups a year to Cuba, so we have some experience in sending people to Cuba.
And we've worked with you guys before too. It's great to see you, Jim.
And so we've done trips for you and many others. I was in Cuba last on Sunday, and I was with a high-level political group from Washington, and you know, the interesting comment that I got from some of the people on the group is, this is such a fascinating place. I wonder how I, as an individual, despite my government position, could actually do business here. So many Americans are looking at it saying, this is a great opportunity. How do I take advantage? How do I buy real estate? How do I support a small business here? How do I invest in somebody that's going to take advantage of changes we think are to come? What is your suggestion on how Americans can invest directly or indirectly in Cuba, given the current regulations?
We only answer these questions when there's a consulting fee involved. So.
Actually, there are so many consulting firms coming up from everywhere. Everybody wants to provide advice on how to invest in Cuba. So many Cuban Americans who know United States now and know Cuba are setting up their firms. So you should have no trouble getting lots of advice on that.
Your advice?
My advice is to find a Cuban partner immediately, and you can be sort of the silent partner providing the funding, some good ideas, but at this time you need I think a Cuban, unless you're a big multinational and want to enter a joint venture with a state firm. But as an individual, you need a Cuban partner.
And I would recommend that this be someone that you develop a relationship with, because legally you could be left holding the bag or holding the debt, right? Because the law now stands, it's very hard or impossible for a foreigner to gain, ownership rights and the power to sue or whatever if things go south. So I would say that. Also, I would also point and encourage people to talk to Cuba Emprende and Cuba Emprende Foundation if they're interested in seeding or funding the small business trainings that John McIntyre helps with. So I would say that also.
Nice. Yeah, just back here. Yep.
Hey, my name is Alex Clement. I'm an analyst at Eurasia Group, which is a political risk consulting firm. We deal with a lot of investors and companies. I've been to Cuba a number of times, and my professional background is actually in Russia.
Would you mind standing up just so we could see you?
I would not mind at all standing up.
Thanks.
So my background is actually in Russia, which I think offers some instructive parallels and maybe cautions as Cuba makes this transition. And one of the things that comes to mind is and I want to ask you the question about rule of law in the sense of not only the government opening space for entrepreneurs to operate, but also creating good rules of the game to protect them not only from the state, but also from each other, right? So what is the situation in terms of the government putting together kind of not only opening the field, but creating rules of the game? And then looking ahead, particularly looking back at the Russia case, you mentioned that there's an obvious tension between rising economic power and then increasing political demands that the government may not welcome. And after Fidel goes, you mentioned there could be a real political transition. And one of the big risks in Russia in the early 90s was that in a period of rapid political transformation, the rules of the game failed to keep up with the sort of entrepreneurial rush that was unleashed. And what in effect you ended up having was a small number of well-connected elites essentially hijacking the state and hijacking the assets of the state and forming a new kind of oligopoly. So I just want to ask a question about where you see this question of rule of law now and what the risks and sort of outlook might be after a transition. Thank you, and thank you very much for a wonderful presentation, by the way.
When I was researching for my dissertation and the parts that we used in the book, I came across this great quote from a whole group of sociologists who studied the transition in Eastern Europe and studied why it happened and how it happened, et cetera. Because I was trying to find a model for Cuba and the underground economy and all of that, the black market, the second economy. And one of the things that I came across was the things that bring down socialism don't necessarily serve to build capitalism. And this is the fear that they were pointing to that lead to the erosion of a socialist economy and state don't necessarily bode well for the establishment of rule of law. People in Cuba have long ago developed socios, and so in Cuba they have a mix of socialismo and socialismo. Friendism or buddyism. I actually got to give Arch credit for that book because in his 1972 book, he mentions and introduced me to that amiguismo and socialismo. And so that could be problematic. Another thing that could be problematic in the Cuba case is that they move not from state socialism into a kind of free market with more or less equal opportunity for the people of Cuba to take advantage, but from state socialism to state capitalism, and I think that that's dangerous and potentially could come because a lot of the economy is increasingly run by the army and by former generals who are retired and now run sectors of the economy, and so I would say that is a danger. I'll stop there.
Over here. Great. So we have, I apologize. We have time for about just one more question, and then hopefully maybe if you guys can stay a little while and mingle with the crowd. But I just want to make sure that we end on time here. So I'm sorry. I think there was a question here that we had been waiting to give the mic to, and then I'm so sorry. Then we can hopefully have an informal discussion after this. Thanks. Go ahead.
Thanks. I'm Dr. Sima Oyam, and I'm a personal advisor, and I wanted to ask, what is the position of American Cubans who were born in Cuba and want to go back and do business in Cuba?
Well, there's not one type of Cuban American. I would say that the Cuban American community has never been monolithic, but is especially not monolithic today. And so increasingly, and there was just a poll that was released yesterday, and you could probably find it in the news from yesterday. It was presented as part of the NASDAQ thing that was co-sponsored by the Americas Society yesterday, and it talks about the increasing shift of Cuban Americans towards supporting doing business with and in Cuba, also against the embargo, for free travel to Cuba. So the Cuban American community also has an incentive to stay in touch, because a lot of the Cuban American community before 1980 doesn't have contacts in Cuba, but the people have come since then, especially in the 90s and in the last 15 or so years. Almost all of them have family in Cuba, effective economic connections to Cuba, and now, in the last 2 years, one of the things that's happened is Cubans are increasingly a transnational group because the migration reform that happened has allowed Cubans to spend time abroad and go back without losing their legal rights and connections to Cuba. And even the loophole is that a Cuban who comes to the United States for a year and a day can become a U.S. resident. But then they can go back to Cuba and be a Cuban resident. So they don't have to break ties, and they could be potentially dual citizens, even though illegally that's not yet possible, but practically that could work. Did you want to add anything to that?
No, that's good.
I have information on that. Okay.
And
so anyone else who wants to ask questions or talk, we're hanging out. Hopefully they'll break out the wine and we can.
Well, no, I think we have to clear out of this room, but we, people can go downstairs and hopefully, on your way out, mingle and ask some questions. So with that, I want to thank Ted and Archibald for joining us today on their book launch.